He's a pro.
Welcome. Again, my name is Dr. Christopher Endrinal. I'm an associate professor in the Bauer School of Music and Arts at Florida Gulf Coast University, and I'm so happy to be here with Bob Beatty. He's a historian, a musician, a writer, and Allman Brothers superfan. Yeah, so I'm going to pass the mic over to Bob because he wants to say some stuff about his work and about his book before we get the conversation going. So
thank you. Thanks, Chris, and please give Steph. Where did you go? There you are. Give Stephanie a big hand, please. Listen, and her friends. She's got several of her colleagues who are here supporting her tonight. I deal with state and local history. I worked at a county history museum in Orlando, the History Center, if you've ever been. That was where I really got my start before I went and started working nationally. These institutions are really vital to the fabric of American communities. They're very vital to democracy, and in a lot of ways. It's not the simple, 1 + 1 equals democracy, humanities, dealing in the public sphere. You heard Stephanie say public history a lot. You may, if you're not inside baseball for public history, is the way that academic historians and historians who do work not for other academics, readable books. That's really what it is. And the other thing we do, though, is we spend a lot of time in museums, working at historic sites, and trying to bring, history and the understanding of it down to the really local level and offer an opportunity for conversation, whether it be within the exhibitions, within the museum, or within your own community when you go there. So this is a big deal for me. This is my third stop on this tour, coming down to Florida. And I talked with Stephanie. I've talked with a lot of my friends over the time and said, hey, do you want to do something cool? And the bottom line is I do this better with somebody asking me questions than standing up here and lecturing. And here's why. Because I'm here to sell books. I need to tell you right now, I'm here to sell books. My book is $30. That's basically the price that I get and can sustain through the press. This book's on University Press of Florida, so it's a part of the long lineage. I know Florida Gulf Coast has also publishes books through UPF as well. I'm here to sell books, and my idea is if I do a good enough show with you ahead of time, you will buy. My goal is everybody leave here with one copy. And the reason why is I need gas money to get back home, which is how the Highwaymen used to do it as well. It's actually really, it all comes full circle when you mention the Highwaymen today. So here's the deal. Treat this as if it's a show. If you enjoy it and you want to learn more, I hope you will go home with a book as my expectation. I didn't put my books by the door to keep you from leaving, so I gotta trust that you'll just make your way over there and do that. The other thing is, I wrote this book not just for people who love the Allman Brothers, but people like Chris who love music and popular culture and how it interacts with the world. I find a lot of meaning in studying history through popular culture and through music. Music is a conversation. It's a conversation with people who come before you. It's a conversation with your bandmates, and it's a conversation, if you record it, actually, if you play it, period. It's a conversation that happens in the moment. If you record it, you capture it, and you get a chance to maybe put it out on an album or something. But for the most part, conversation happens in settings like this, when we're recording conversations and not sending it out for anything bigger than that. The Allman Brothers are ultimately I call them in my preface, or it might be in the introduction, but the best conversationalists in rock, are among the best. And if you listen to their music, and whether you have or not, I hope you'll at least have a renewed appreciation today for it. They are talking to each other constantly on the album At Fillmore East. It is a conversation between musicians, and that's ultimately jazz. That comes from jazz, the jazz impulse. And I'm talking with a musicologist today, so he could probably, shave some rough edges off this, but to me, jazz is the melding of two traditions, and it happened in America. It's the African-American tradition and the sort of Western European musical tradition that flows out of more or less New Orleans. And the irony of that, or not irony, but we are here today on the 100th anniversary of Louis Armstrong's first recordings with Kid Oliver's band, and including Blabbermouth, and then the other song is I'm forgetting now, which was his more famous song. But Blabbermouth was Louis Armstrong. So we're here 100 years from when Louis Armstrong, more or less, put his signature sound down that really, honestly, is responsible for this major stream of American music. Jazz, it's new. The Allman Brothers are jazz, though they don't play traditional jazz. They are rock musicians who attempt jazz, and they really approach it through blues.
Say some stuff for the interview, man.
Yeah, okay, thank you. Okay, so thank you. So the final thing I'll say on that then, which is it. The reason why I like to do this is because conversation is jazz for me as a public humanities professional, as a historian, as a public historian. And I'd like to show you an example of how like-minded people coming together can create some jazz or create some magic that's specific to the moment. That's how the Allman Brothers work. So that's really the piece that I want to lay out. I'm here to sell books. I really want you to buy 2 copies, one for yourself and one to give away. And the final thing is we're sort of demonstrating this rather than me lecturing and forcing you to look at me and listen to me, and I'm good at that, I promise you I can do it, but I think it's more meaningful to me when I have a sympathetic person with me who's throwing me some notes. He can keep us moving because he understands we're watching y'all, we know what clicks with you guys, including when your face goes a little dull. That's okay, it happens to all of us, but that's what we're here for. Sell books, talk jazz. I'm gonna turn it over to Chris.
Thanks. So, we started the evening today. You mentioned public history. That was actually my first question. So thank you for clarifying what actually public history is. It's history for everybody, not just academics. And being an academic myself, I can appreciate both. Highly academic writing and writing that's geared for a more general audience. And so, as someone who reads both, I can appreciate the language and tone of your book. It is geared for a general audience. It does talk about music in technical terms very, very lightly, but it is an easy read for you guys. I mean, I made it through the book in just a couple of days. So, thank you for clarifying public history.
There
but
you go.
Let's start at square one. Who are the Allman Brothers? And why did you want to write, first of all, a dissertation on a rock band who actually wasn't around for that? I mean, they've been around, but your book focuses on the original vision of Duane Allman. And so the original Allman Brothers were around for 4 years. Poof, gone. So who were they? What captivated them? What captivated you about them and about their music? So much so that you had to write a dissertation, and then you weren't done with that. You had to expand the dissertation into a book, which, by the way, I'm doing myself, so I'm going to take some notes.
This is an excellent question. So to explain very quickly, PhD, when you get a PhD or when you get a master's or a PhD in a humanities discipline, you typically write an end paper. A master's, it's a thesis. Your PhD is a dissertation. Really thick, whole body. Chris knows exactly what I mean. It was 500 pages. So backing up, the Allman Brothers are 6 Southerners. I call them Southerners, even though one of the 6 was actually originally from Chicago. But let's start with Duane Allman and Greg Allman, who are from Daytona Beach. Duane is a guitarist. He is the founder of the band, the leader of the band, until he dies 2.5 years into their run. Greg Allman, probably the more famous. He spent a lot of time on the southwest coast of Florida, particularly up around Sarasota. I know tons of people who have stories about Greg, but he led that band 43 years after Duane's death. He was also the last person to join the band, interestingly enough. J. Johnny Johnson, African-American drummer from Biloxi-ish, Gulfport, Mississippi, who had played in Otis Redding's band, Joe Tex's band, Percy Sledge's band. He was a backing musician for a lot of rhythm and blues stars. Butch Trucks is J-Mo's a drummer. Butch Trucks is also a drummer. There are 2 drummers in the Allman Brothers band. Butch is from Jacksonville, Florida. Also had spent some time, not as much down on this coast, but he had recorded a number of singles down in Miami. So Miami was kind of the center of the Florida recording industry in the mid to late 60s all the way through. Let's see, Dickey Betts, Forrest Richard Betts from actually West Palm Beach, Florida, but also up in Manatee County. I think he's in Osprey now. Also has spent a tremendous amount of time. I'm supporting his son Duane Betts, and he's got made in Sarasota, Florida. So I'm going Southwest Florida for y'all today. I hope you appreciate that. So Dickey played lead guitar also, which is also completely strange because Duane Allman was a lead guitar player. And then I think did I mention Barry Oakley on bass? I think that's the last one. Barry was from Chicago, had relocated to the Sarasota area in 67, 68. Eventually makes his way to Jacksonville, which is where the band all follows. That's where they form in March 26, 1969. March 23rd is when they jam together. March 26th is when Greg shows up, and that's the date that the band starts. So they're a band of 6 Southerners who forms in Jacksonville. About 2 weeks after they form, they end up going to Macon, Georgia, and staying permanently. That becomes their permanent home. And really today, it's still kind of home base. For me, there's a couple things. And I've missed this. I was rewatching my talk the other day, and I was like, I forget talking about this. The music is what always did it for me. So it was when I got to the Allman Brothers in my listening, and it was later in college, I had already listened to a ton of blues, a ton of what we call classic rock today, rock and roll. I had gone through my punk rock and alternative phase and everything else. And I got to the Allman Brothers and I heard something that I really hadn't heard in anybody else. And if you're it was completely different. So that was the first thing, was like, whoa, there's something more for me to learn. And I kept, this is a band with ultimately a 45-year history. It was around 25 or so years when I got into them. And so I kept digging deeper, and I found some things I didn't like, but for the most part, the caliber and the quality of the music was great. But the story is really what got me. And there's 2 parts of it that get me. I think the easy one was what I see is cooperation. What I see is music is one place where people can sort of put inhibitions down and play without worrying about who you are as you approach it, etc. I mean, they were an integrated band at the tail end of the Civil Rights Movement. This is after the Voting Rights Act, after the Civil Rights Act, where they formed in 1969. But things are still pretty serious. And they traveled around with a black man in their band, and they played black music without really, without an affect. And that's J-Mo, one of the 6 principals and one of the founding drummers, has said those many words to me. And he said them repeatedly in the book, too. But, so that was one. There was a lot of cooperation. Second one, of course, was the music. I saw something in the Allman Brothers story that made me feel better about the South than I had felt going into it. I study Southern history, and I understand everything that's going on in the world right now and in this country and everything else. I'm a historian, and one of the reasons I study history is to make sense of the crap sometimes. And to find a better way, and they offered a better way to me, my very early ability to see things. Now, as I unpack it more, it's a lot more complex than I'm making it, but I think it's the 2 things. The writing of the book, I think, is multiple factors, but one of the big ones was I did want to get a PhD, partially because when I was working in the museum field, I would roll with historians and not feel like I was adequate. Like, you know how people can be in the academy. So I always wanted to get a PhD. The dissertation was the rough draft of this book. The book was always the goal. I just wanted to write a book on the Allman Brothers because I was so knocked out by them. I wanted to see, it was like an exercise. I could see if I could do it, more or less.
That's awesome. I can relate to a lot of that.
I bet you can.
I wrote my dissertation on the music of Irish rock group U2. And it started for me just like with Bob, with the sound, right? And it started with me, the sound of U2's music in the 80s. And then when I got to graduate school, I was like, hey, that sounds pretty cool. Let me see if I can analyze that, right? So I get where that came from, because you didn't necessarily plan on it. You heard something in that music and you're like, ooh, there's something in that.
Yeah.
And you had to break it down, right? I think perhaps you mentioned you heard something in the Allman Brothers music that was different from anything that you had heard before. And I think part of that stems from the unique makeup of the Allman Brothers band. It was a typical rock band is 4 players. You've got the drummer in the back, you got the bass guitar, you got the lead guitarist or the rhythm guitarist, and you've got the front man who can sometimes play guitar. So right off the bat, in terms of numbers, the Allman Brothers are different. But beyond numbers, they're different because they didn't have one drummer, they had two drummers, which is weird. Because the drummer is the glue for any band. The drummer is the head of the rhythm section, and without the drummer, the band doesn't go anywhere. To have two leaders, that's weird. But they didn't only just have two drummers, they had two lead guitarists. It's common to have multiple guitarists in a rock band, but to have two people who consider themselves lead guitarists, that's a weird thing. Can you talk about that?
So in that era, the Beatles were the model, and any of you who are of that era, right? It's or even shortly thereafter, the Beatles show up on Ed Sullivan, and Tom Petty's most famous for saying it. There was a way. I had to go get myself a guitar, find myself who had another guitar, this and that. But exactly what Chris said. The Beatles were kind of the model. The Rolling Stones were very much like this too. They had two guitars, but they were mostly rhythm. But you have drums, bass, two guitars, sometimes add a lead singer to the mix or something like that. The instruments are easy, right? Unlike, hauling pianos or horns around, guitars were super easy for people to have and to do, super easy to learn. Back to Chris's question, the lead guitar part is, remarkable enough in and of itself, because the only band, there weren't a lot of bands that were playing dual lead guitar in the era. There were moments when some artists did. Jeff Beck did it occasionally. Mike Bloomfield would, and some of his various iterations. But even the Paul Butterfield Blues Band, which released two records with Mike Bloomfield in '65 and '66, Elvin Bishop played almost exclusively rhythm guitar, and he was a ripping lead guitarist. So Duane Allman had a chance after 1968. He recorded Hey Jude with Wilson Pickett. I trying to get a sense of age group in here, but does any of you remember when that song was on the charts? Okay. Last night I had a whole bunch of people say yes. So 1968, Duane Allman recorded a cover of Hey Jude with Wilson Pickett. I highly recommend you listen to it as soon as you can. It's got the solo to end all solos on it. Actually, Eric Clapton for years called it his favorite guitar solo. And Eric claims he called Atlantic Records as soon as he heard and said, "Who is that guitar player?" At the same time, Phil Walden, who was Otis Redding's manager, Otis Redding died in a plane crash in December of 1967. Walden was looking to get into white rock and roll. Literally, those are his words. And here's Hey Jude while he's visiting Atlantic Records in New York. He hears it on a tape and says, "Who is that? I gotta sign him." Fast forward just a bit. Duane actually has a contract at that point with Rick Hall in Fame Studios and is trying to do a solo record that's not going well. And partially because, I got Dickey saying this in the book, Duane was too warm and personal for being the front man. He wanted to be a part of the group, and that's really vitally important to this equation. So, long story short, Walden buys his contract, says, "Duane, go form a band." Now, Duane has J-Mo in tow already as a drummer. He's got a drummer who plays, according to everybody, according to Walden, he plays so weird nobody knows if he's any good. And Duane's like, "Are you kidding? This cat's burning." And J-Mo as a drummer is he's a unique cat anyway, but as a drummer, he's not a power drummer. He's a jazz drummer. He's really Elvin Jones is really his probably closest corollary that I can listen to. So J-Mo's in the band. Duane is trying to get Barry Oakley as a bass player in the band, but Barry is in another group with Dickey Betts, Sarasota native, Manatee County native, called The Second Coming, named after Barry Oakley's resemblance to Jesus Christ. That's a true story. Actually, if you said it on Monday, Thursday, I better be careful. But he's trying to get Barry to join the band. Barry doesn't want to leave Second Coming because he's in a band with Dickey Betts. And Dickey Betts is really good. So they start playing together. And Duane, who is supposed to be forming a power trio that he leads, all of a sudden now he's got two drummers and two guitar players. Simply because he kept adding pieces that were, I guess the best way to say it, he had a sound in his head he was trying to get out. And he kept failing at it until he found these other 5 pieces. And he created something completely different because, of course, the two twin guitars was a country music thing. It was Buck Owens and Don Rich. It was going all the way back to Western swing music, but it was not something you heard a lot in rock music, if at all. And it started from there. I mean, actually a lot of heavy metal bands in the 70s and 80s had twin guitars. It was something, I don't know if they learned it from the Allman Brothers or it just became something folks did, but it was a unique alignment out the chute. And it was very Southern in its sensibilities and how he put it together, I suppose. I'm making that up as I say this now that I'm thinking about it. But two drummers, two guitarists. He calls Greg on the phone sometime after their first jam and he says, hey, we got two lead guitarists and two drummers. And Greg's like, what in the hell are you talking about? And Greg's in LA, he's fulfilling a record contract, and he says, I need you to come back. Nobody knows to write, and really nobody sings all that much. So that's how Greg ends up back in the band. He is the sixth member to join the Allman Brothers band. So there was no Allman Brothers until Greg shows back up.
Interesting winding history with this band. 'Cause it didn't start out with the arrangement that Bob writes about in his book. But you mentioned, well, the South plays a huge role in the Allman Brothers. It plays a huge role in their catalog, it plays a huge role in their sound, it plays a huge role in how Duane Allman thinks about the band's sound. The South and the location of the South, not just the concept of the South, but the actual location was important to the band, especially Duane Allman. Can you briefly talk about when they moved to California and didn't find it, and then came back, and then it didn't take long at all?
Yeah. It literally, the South centers this story, and Florida is very much the South in this region. I know you all live sort of on the fringes of, the real, like that, the area I just drove through, real deep South Florida, which is not that far from, this corridor here. But Florida at the end of World War II, going into World War II, has less people than Arkansas. Coming out of World War II, it is the state, the behemoth that we know today. So I want to say it's a Southern story, and I wanted it to be a Florida story. I really did, because that's my roots. But it's honestly, yes, these players happen to be in Florida, and that's where they formed. But they were engaged with musicians all across the South doing this. So but the place is important. Let me get it back to that. What Chris was just prompting me. 1965-66, the Allman Joys, Greg and Duane's first band, go to...
What a great band.
I was going to say, cheeky great band name is that.
Joys?
The Allman Joys, yes, I agree with that. So the Allman Joys go up to New York City to audition and fail. When you're in the South, in this region, you don't stay in the South to make it. You have to leave as a musician, particularly bands. But even the individuals end up leaving. Probably one of the bigger ones from this state is Stephen Stills, who was spent a lot of time up in Florida, spent some time in Gainesville, but goes out in 65, 64 and forms Buffalo Springfield with Neil Young, who's from Canada, of all places. But, they had to leave to make it. Duane and Greg tried 3 different times. They went to New York and failed an audition. They eventually go to Nashville in the summer of 1966, which is really the first stop most Southern musicians make. But Nashville is famous for what? Country music. So they're a poor fit there. Nashville hasn't discovered the lucrative rock market, and they put out a couple singles that flop completely. They're covers. They're a cover band almost 100%. John D. Loudermilk, the author of Tobacco Road, that real famous garage band song, takes them under his wing. When he can't sell anything, he says, you guys got to go west, which meant California. That was the final kind of stop. You could go to Nashville, Chicago, or New York, or LA. Those were basically the main places. Somewhat like Memphis, and some of the river cities would also pick up some business, but those were the big places. They go to LA, they get a contract. They get found, and they go to LA and are in a band called Hourglass. It's a producer-driven effort. They're on a record label called Liberty Records. which ironically has Johnny Winter and Canned Heat, if you guys know those blues names there. But for some reason, Liberty wanted to make them, I call it like, it's like Tom Jones psychedelia. Greg singing, if any of you have ever heard the Hourglass stuff, it just doesn't fit. Well, and basically after 2 years of trying that, Duane quits, comes back to Florida in September of 1968, and in a span of about 3 weeks, he quits his band, comes back to Florida, forms a new band with Butch Trucks, and his mates called 31st of February, records down in Hialeah at High Tone, or at Tone Studios, or its predecessor. Then they break up, then Greg leaves back to LA, and Duane goes to Muscle Shoals and begins his Muscle Shoals career. So it's in Muscle Shoals where Duane recovers whatever it was he felt he lost. LA was everything that I guess we imagine it to be even today. Real freaky, real out of the, just completely different than the Florida that they were used to, and the South. Duane somehow determines, while he's sitting there in Muscle Shoals, not gigging for the only time in his life, somehow determines I gotta stay South. So all these things sort of come into play. J-Mo comes over, Barry starts jamming, and eventually they make their way to Jacksonville. But the key point then is they end up in Macon under the auspices of their manager, Phil Walden, who is giving them money, who fights every effort to move them out of the South to break them nationally. And any of you guys who were alive in this era or shortly thereafter knows the reputation the South had in the late 1960s, actually all throughout really the civil rights era, and it's a legit reputation, y'all, I want to say. Neil Young is singing to the South, Southern man, you better keep your head or lose your head. Don't forget what the good book said. He's calling this out. Leonard Skinner later writes songs about it. So the South is not a popular place to be. And one of the things that the record company begins to think is one reason the Allman Brothers aren't breaking is because they're so Southern, which is just really interesting. And when the quick note on that, when a biography came out in 1995 on this band, when that guy Scott Freeman first started shopping it, 1995, it might have even been before, the argument from the publishing house is, well, nobody in the South reads. So, you know, like, they were overcoming all of that, and the Allman Brothers have too, as a that mindset. So the South was important. Let me get back to that point, because I just went off on a little tangent. This is jazz. This is jazz. I had to pull myself back here. But they set up home base in Macon, and the comments repeatedly throughout their history are, thank God we stayed in the South. That was vitally important to them and to the ability to make the music that they thought that they could most effectively.
Yeah, you take lots of opportunities to drive home the point in the book that the South is so important to Duane Allman and the band. In fact, I have several highlights here. Chapter 3, right? This is from the book where the Allman Brothers go out, or Duane and Greg go out west to California. Quote, in California, Duane also learned an important lesson about geography. It wasn't the South. And the South was very important to his musical vision. He would struggle to fully express himself musically until he did. That's chapter 3. Chapter 4, frustration in California. While in Los Angeles, the band bonded off stage with the music of their home region. Southern music offered comfort for the frustrated, homesick musicians. Chapter 5, and I quote, Duane returns to the South for good. Quote, the musicians were also comfortable back at home. Quote, it felt so good we were back down south on our turf, Greg recalled. Why did we ever leave? Sandlin asked. And then, so, you know, it wasn't just Duane. It was the entire band who, they didn't fit out there. Because LA, as maybe some of you know, is a completely different world. It's a completely different, I mean, West Coast, East Coast, there is a completely different ethos out west. And it was an aesthetic, I think, that the Allman Brothers, it wasn't their aesthetic. And their producer, when they were in LA, tried to mold them into that SoCal sound. These guys were from Florida, Georgia. They're not SoCal, and they didn't want to be SoCal. And they gave it a little bit of a try,
Yeah.
But Duane Allman had a vision in his ear and in his mind of what he wanted his band to be, and it wasn't the SoCal. And when they returned to the South is when things started to happen, and happened very, very quickly for the band. You mentioned within the span of 3 weeks, Duane changed everything about it, which was amazing. Sticking with the sense of the South and a sense of place, I think, which was so important. All these quotes about how the band was uncomfortable not being in the South, I think they weren't succeeding in the studio, I think, because they were being forced to write and produce music that wasn't their own.
Yeah.
What sound were they trying to find?
Okay, so I want to place this for y'all real quick. That when Bill McEwen discovers what becomes this group Hourglass, which is a group that was around for about a year, he calls LA and says, "I just discovered the next Rolling Stones." He had seen this phenomenal bar band, basically, and they were apparently really good. But they go out to LA and they sign with a record label that's used to a very cookie-cutter production model. Here's the songs you're going to sing. Let's put the singer out front, raise his vocals. We'll put the music down, and then they put him in costumes. And I don't run a PowerPoint, but at times I'll do that. There's a picture of Duane with a doily around his neck. I mean, it looks really bad. And they said we just felt silly in these outfits. So another thing that comes out of them coming home is they literally take the stage in jeans and t-shirts. They're no longer dressing up for the thing. The sound, this is, they fight for this. It's not as if, they formed in 1969. They released a record in fall of 1969 and another one, Idlewild South, in fall of 1970, and neither of them sell that much. But the reviews are really good, and the reviews of the concerts are really good. And almost all of them say, sounds great, but it just doesn't sound like it sounds live. Well, that was worse in the Hourglass days because they weren't allowed to play very often, number one. The record company was saving them for some reason, so they weren't allowed to play very often. They were being force-fed how to do things and how to arrange things. So the South, the production method alone of Southern Studios was real. I mean, listen, the producer was still in charge. Rick Hall ran that studio like nobody's business, but parts were developed organically. Vocals were worked on and arrangements were worked on organically. It wasn't like you go in, all right, now we got to put the string section in, put a lot of reverb on these vocals, etc. It was a whole different model of how they did it, and Phil Walden, their manager, was right along with that. So it happens quickly. They develop and play a really good live sound, but they have a really hard time putting it down on record in a way that people will buy it to sustain them. And so that's where they were road dogs. They spent 300 days a year on the road, probably paid a couple hundred shows a year for their first couple of years. And it dang near killed them. It did end up basically killing two of them.
Well, that sense of place, I think, is such an interesting concept because you said that they were on the road for so long, and being out on the road and touring, you don't have a sense of place, right? Because you're living out of a suitcase. You're living in hotel rooms. So not only were they in California trying to produce music, or they were being forced to produce music that they didn't believe in, they were also touring on the road, so they didn't have a sense of roots. They didn't have a sense of place until they got back to the South. And once they got back to the South, it was like, all right, we're home now. And you know that feeling when you get home, right? Everything's comfortable, right? Like, especially when you pull into your driveway after a long road trip, you're like, oh, just kick off your shoes, take off your jacket, you're like, yeah, let's get comfortable. And musicians like being comfortable. Artists like being comfortable because that's when they can create the most easily, when they don't have that pressure on them. So it wasn't until they got back to the South in early '69, I believe, when things really started to take off. But it's so connected to that sense of place.
He was never able to, Duane was never able to break through until he established his band in the South and did it. And what's weird about this is, these guys were rock and roll guys, so I don't want to, listen, there were lives left behind that have suffered for their art, if you will. Wives, girlfriends, children, etc. There's a whole bunch of broken relationships there. They had attempted, especially before Duane died and before Barry Oakley died, they had attempted to create, they were trying to have their cake and eat it too. Like we go on the road, we party like rock stars, because they are rock stars. And then they come home to Macon and it's sort of the hominess place. I think it was vital to them that they had that home place, even though they never really spent a lot of time there. And it was almost as if, I will say, I can't prove this, I would never write this, but once Macon stopped being the hub like it was, that's when things really started breaking up. But I can't see any other way for it to turn out the way it did, if that makes sense.
Sure. So the band comes back to the South and they start recording some stuff and they're jamming and they're getting along really well. And then 71 comes along and it's the album. It's At Fillmore East. It's like this book, most of the book is written to make the album At Fillmore East, that's the culmination. It's the culmination of the book. It's the culmination of the band's, it's their apex, essentially. Tell me about the album.
Yeah.
So it's a live album, which is not unheard of, but this one is rare in that even most bands who record live albums, they do a lot of editing on that live footage afterwards. They might stitch together some things, they might add some things, they might take something back. The Allman Brothers didn't do that. It was essentially virtually untouched, which was unheard of then. That never happens in 2023. So they had to be on their game, which is why the album is so good.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So talk to us about the album now. Yeah. So we're in 71, and the Allman Brothers are the Allman Brothers.
End of 1970, they put out On a Wild South, their second record. It's a good record. I listened to it on the way over today, actually, just to reacquaint myself with it. It sounds like a well-produced rock and roll record from 1970. This is also, by the way, coincident to the Layla record that Duane Allman was on with Eric Clapton on Derek and the Dominoes. So sometime in late 1970, early 71, sometime in later 70, they say, look, we have one album left to go. They were going to get dropped. They were going to break the band up. There were all kinds of issues. They had one shot here. And somehow they come up with the idea, we've got to record a live album. Now what Chris was saying, what's unique about them doing it is two things. One is they were an absolutely unknown band on the marketplace and the big thing. So to sell, live records were a replacement for studio records for well-known artists. That's essentially what it was. The Beach Boys had done a record called, I think it's Beach Boys Now or Today. Literally, it's a completely studio record with live audience piped in. The Rolling Stones did one, I think Got Live If You Want It, and I think that same sort of deal. The only thing live on it was the audience. The Allman Brothers took it completely differently. I'll say this, established artists also did it. Ray Charles released live records. Muddy Waters, one of the Allman Brothers, Duane and Greg's most important records is B.B. King's Live at the Regal. Johnny Cash had reinvented himself in 1968 with the prison concerts. John Coltrane had reinvented himself with Village Vanguard. This is new stuff. Not uncommon for established artists, but very uncommon. And then it's your shot. This is it. Yeah. So, a couple things about the record that I want to point out. One is what Chris said. They found a set list that they liked, and if you have anything from them in 1971, it's pretty much the same set list. They were rehearsing for a record from January to March. They recorded that record in 2 days, 4 concerts in New York City at Fillmore East that are documented in the book. And then they toured that record all through 1971. It gets released in July. It hits gold by October. 500,000 units sold. That is way more than 5 times what they had sold to that point. 100% live record. It's a double album, which was not necessarily something that they were originally going to do. The record company sold it for a single album price, because this is the people's band. I'm very proud of that, by the way, how I handled that in the book. They were the people's band, and they offered things for free because they used to play free shows, and they gave you a discount on your record. It's got 7 songs on close to 80 minutes of music on 4 sides of the record. That's also, it's a lot of quality, low quantity of music. 2 of the songs are close to 20 minutes. 2 of the songs are instrumentals. One of them is the 2 20-minute songs have lyrics, but it's long instrumental passages, You Don't Love Me and Whipping Post. And what Chris said, it's not virtually. Every note on that album is untouched, and in post-production, it is exactly how it was. There's 2 edits though. If you know the record, Stormy Monday had a harmonica solo in it that got taken out. And then You Don't Love Me is the patch of 2 different versions. And they split it right where Dickey Betts takes over from Duane Allman's solo. So it's almost like they sandwiched 2 versions perfectly together. But that's it. They didn't fix a note. There are very few, there are some, but not very many. They literally stood there, just like John Coltrane when he recorded A Love Supreme, stood in the room, but they did it in front of 2,500 people. Probably coked to the gills, maybe not drunk yet at that point, but it was
By the end of the show.
But yes, exactly. But they played 4 shows in New York City, most important audience in rock, and they absolutely captured exactly what they were wanting to. And the reason I know this, and this is why the book goes to that, is because I spend a lot of time in the book saying this is what Duane wants to do with music. And how do we know if he accomplished that? One way we know is by looking at what people are saying about what he wrote, about the music. At Fillmore East is that pinnacle for them. All the band members will say it. Absolutely captured that band at a perfect moment is the best way to say it. Because remember, it's not a concert. It's not a concert document. It's 4 different shows, and they pick the best of each of those to make a record. And that's what you do in the studio too, to be honest with you. You pick your best take, and you also build your best take. You don't do that when you're playing live. So it's 100% live, and that's how improvisation, creativity, in front of an audience. The audience is vital to the Allman Brothers. I'm convinced it's why their studio records didn't sell. Is that they just didn't have that energy that the audience gives, just like y'all give me energy when I'm talking. It's for real.
It's true. I'm sure Bob can attest to this too, because he's played. But performers, especially musicians who can see their audience, they feed off of the energy of the room. When I'm teaching my students, and it's a day that my students aren't in class much, it's one of those low attendance days, I feel it. But when I have a full class of students, let's go, yeah. Right? And so the Allman Brothers were one of those bands that fed off of, they not only fed off, they needed the audience there. And I have a couple quotes from your book about writing an album. This is Duane Allman, quote, "I never want a hit record." Who says that when they're in the music industry? I never want a hit record. I do not want that wherever I go, I have to play the same song. I want to do whatever I want to do. How rock and roll is that? I want to be free. I don't want fame and fortune. I just want enough money to eat regular and to pay my bills. That's all I want out of life. Oh, and to play my guitar. Right? He didn't want much, but he spent a lot of time looking for it, because he ran into roadblock after roadblock that either he was forced to do something else, or he just didn't have the right concoction of people and places and instruments. Yeah, amazing. And then so At Fillmore East, live album. It's a compilation. Yeah, it's a pastiche of 4 performances. So I'm gonna get a little personal here. What are some of your favorite moments on At Fillmore East, and why those moments?
Man, what a great question.
Why handful of moments that when you're playing, you're like, this is why I wanted to write about this album.
Yeah. So I did. In hindsight, I didn't actually want to write about this album. I wanted to write about the greatness of the Allman Brothers Band. The problem is there is no measure for that except each of us individually, right? I think they're great. Some people think they're just okay, and you know, like my family, they'll hum along to it, but only because they've been stuck listening to it. They don't like it. So that was like, I had to go to the record because I had to have an argument by which to do the book. Probably the hardest thing I ever did, and it was a friend handed that to me, to be honest with you. But back to the moments. Okay, listen, there's two. You Don't Love Me is actually probably my least favorite song on the record, which that doesn't say much. Like, I love every song on that album. But there's two moments in it. The second one, total decrescendo, the whole band is dropping out, and you're in New York City. I don't know if you've ever been to New York. It's a loud place. It's a lot louder than Naples, Florida, I'll tell you that. And even at quiet moments these days at concerts, no, you hear this murmur. Duane, the whole band drops out, and Duane is soloing, and it is whisper damn quiet in that building. And I chills now thinking about it. And all of a sudden you hear this guy, it's at 1618, by the way, he goes, play all night. You guys know, if you know the record, you've heard it a lot. I love that moment, and I've seized that moment. It's the title of my book. The press gave me that title. I had a different one.
That's awesome.
But yes, and I've really embraced it because one of the things about this book that I'm most proud of is the fan voices in it. And that's not been the case in other things. It's always been about the principles. And honestly, who are they making the music for? There are multiple movies. If we sat here and listened to music together, I'd be like, yep, that. I love, probably one of my favorite moments is the fade out at the end of Whipping Post that goes into Mountain Jam, which appears on the next record. So basically they play 23 plus minutes of Whipping Post to kind of close the show. That closes the record. And then they go into a 33-minute improvisation, their only truly improvisational piece, that if I was listening to you and I was going through, I would say, hear this moment, hear this galloping, hear this, hear that. Because that is 6 musicians who have just finished recording an album and are just letting it all hang out on stage. It's not even on the damn record though, it's on the next one. So in the CD era, I put them back together because I want to hear it. And it's basically 55 plus minutes of music jamming on basically 2 songs. And they're not, one's a song. Whipping Post is an actual song. Mountain Jam is based on Donovan's There Is a Mountain, which you may remember. It's a pretty vapid tune compared to what it turned out. There are movements. There are movements in memory of Elizabeth Reed that they don't move me to tears anymore, but that are just like here comes, you know, and release. Every song on it has something like that. There's dog barks in Done Somebody Wrong, which are Greg's foot pedals. The horn got turned off, so I hear 2 dog barks. I'm deaf in one ear too, so like I have really acute hearing for a deaf guy. But I also have set ways I listen to it too, because I want to be able to listen to the whole thing kind of in order. So a lot of times I'll listen to the back half, which is when I want to meditate, I'll put Hot Lana on while I'm settling down, and then I'll listen to that full Liz Reed for 13 minutes. And then by that time I'm in good meditative state, and then got 22 minutes of Whipping Post to really keep me occupied. But the thing that I do, which I'm sure you do too as a musician, as a listener, I will listen to the individual parts. I can parse them and I'll be like, okay, let me follow Barry's bass. And what happens in Allman Brother jams is one person usually spurs the soloist to do something, and the soloist or the accompany will answer. And Barry Oakley, as a bass player, does that a lot. He's constantly soloing, and he's pushing and pulling the musicians as he goes. And if you listen closely, you can hear the soloist like reacting in real time. And those are the moments that are just, you know, because I know how hard it is to do that, you know. And it's done live and it's done on the moment, and that's really something really special.
It really is. I haven't performed regularly in a long time, not since college and graduate school. But I have had a handful of those moments where, you know, the ensemble I was with just completely gelled, and it's one of those moments that you don't really see coming, but you know it when it's happening. But you only know it when you entered that moment.
Yeah.
And you're in the zone, and you don't want to mess it up because you don't want to get out of the zone. So you just let it ride.
Yeah.
And it is truly one of those amazing human experiences that you're just like, well, this is why we do what we do. Stephanie, how long are we going?
I was thinking till 7:10.
Okay, perfect.
Take some questions?
Yeah, well,
You got more?
one more question.
Yeah, go
one more
for it.
question. Because, let's see. Oh, yeah. So, huge Allman Brothers fan. You go to school and write an academic document on them, and then you're changing that document into a book. So this is about the writing of the book itself. What was it like to write this book? So you're a huge fan, but you're also kind of an academic, but a public historian. So you've got like three legs, if you will. So what was your approach writing the book, and what were some of the challenges, foreseen or unforeseen challenges that you had writing this book? Fulfilling your vision, actually.
Yeah, that's
much like Duane.
It's an interesting way to put it too, fulfilling your vision. So, what were some of the challenges? So the very first one was actually coming up with a topic, and I'll say this, like, academics, academically trained historians or academics, period, we go through a very rigorous process to produce material. One that really makes us, I think, challenges our biases a lot. Where it seems like it's easy to say, like, we just throw stuff out there and ignore our biases. I promise you, I'm a lot harder on myself about my biases than anybody else in this country, and anybody else who could accuse me of doing it, just because I know. And so if I lean into a bias, right, I know I feel pretty good about that. This is a band I absolutely adored and absolutely loved, and I think challenge-wise, I had to find a way to step back from that a little bit and try to find some objective way to measure their greatness. And so my dissertation was basically, like I said, a really rough draft. Most of the time when I write, a rough draft is 80% done. And that I've written articles and book chapters and exhibit copy and you name it, grant proposals, blah, blah, blah. Rough draft is done. It's rough draft is smooth sailing from there. And in all honesty, I got to this thing and I was like, what am I going to do with this dissertation? And it was, if it was 50%, if it was 60% done, I'd be surprised. I think it was probably more like 50%. So my challenge was I had to, number one, go from 144,000 to 85,000 words. So I had to cut like 40%. The biggest challenge with that then is less whole chapters that you drop off, because I immediately lopped off 2 chapters of my dissertation, but more, what did that mean? What other stories do you keep? So what I did was, I went through my dissertation. Once I came up with the topic about, my friend said, you just wrote a book on Fillmore East. I'm like, well, what? Huh? Like, how can any one album define the Allman Brothers sound? Like, that's a fanboy bias. I spent a lot of time thinking about not being accused of being a fanboy from people like us. And I mean that since, I was writing a university press book. That's a different sort of tier of things for us. It means something. But I also didn't want to write a nerdy book that only Allman Brother fans would like. My hope is when you all read this, it'll be interesting to you because you enjoy stories about music, you enjoy stories about people and culture, and you enjoy the music in general. That was very intentional. So it was hard for me. What I ended up doing was about 2018 or 19, I finished my dissertation in 18. I started reading books for style of presenting information, less content. Does that make sense?
Sure, of course.
So I was trying to find out how did writers write effective books, particularly of music history, without adding too much of all kinds of things in it. So that was, I'm not going to say that was a challenge because it was new to me to write in that way, The challenge to get past my biases, the challenge to look critically at Duane Allman's career, I chose to stay away from the personal issues with the band. I even said it. Sex and drugs are not of an interest to me when I'm studying any band whatsoever, except, as I said, as it affected the music. So we know sex-wise, they're playing music because they know they're gonna. That one reason they're playing is because they're attracting women. That's a given. Much of their subject matter is going to be about the opposite sex. That's just what blues-based music really is. But they had money problems, they had drug problems, they had relationship problems. So I wanted to stay away from that. I chose the end point of the album and really Barry Oakley's death because I wanted I didn't want to get into when Greg married Cher, when he testified in the federal drug trial.
That's a whole book itself.
Yes, it's coming out. That's coming out. Another scholar's going to write that. Alan Paul's going to write that this summer, or has it coming out this summer. So, and then the other one was this. I turned in my proposal in like June of 2020. I don't know if you guys remember what was happening on the streets in June of 2020.
Nothing.
And of course, but there were protests by then. So we got George Floyd going on by that point. And then, right, we had the whole pandemic. I had my kids. So one of the challenges was, what the hell is going on in the world and why am I even bothering to do this? And then I hit two main points. I hit it in November of that year, where I was like, I don't think I can do this. I hit it again in December, but I pushed through of 2020. And then we'll talk about place. I went down to Macon. I got an Airbnb in February of 2021. It's kind of first time I've been out in a long time, right? This is 2 years into the pandemic. Or I guess a year, almost a year. And I sat down and I just hammered the bad boy down. And I had enough pieces that I could put the puzzle back together. And then it was all editing from February to I turned it in finally by February, actually 2022.
Well, that's academia right there.
Yeah. But it was, in my case, it was like trying to say more with less words. It was like constantly, like every sentence in there, I bet I've gone through like 2 or 3 different times. Like you would have no idea how much attention I paid to those details. And this book, if you're a fan, this book is loaded with details. And if you're not a fan, it's also loaded with details you probably won't catch them in much. And the final one was what I left on the cutting room floor.
I had a question about that. So Bob and I talked a little bit a couple weeks ago, just in preparation for this, and one of Bob's comments to me was, as much fun as he had writing the book, he had to leave a lot on the cutting room floor because it's impossible to include everything. Because if you included everything, this would be a whole set of encyclopedias.
Yeah.
Right. Greg Allman's marriage to Cher, that's like a 3-part series right there, right? Thought train derailed.
You were talking about
on the cutting room floor, yeah. So, and you just mentioned a couple minutes ago, like when you decided to convert the dissertation into a book, you, like right off the bat, you lopped off 2 chapters. So, what else did you leave on the cutting room floor? A, and B. If you could put one thing that you left out of the book in it, what would it be? Okay, so the cutting room floor one, probably the biggest story that I left, and I didn't tell in depth, is the story of the Layla recording. And, I'd say I don't know that y'all know this. Duane and Eric, it's a total serendipity moment where Duane and Eric Clapton meet over in Miami. Duane joins the sessions and produces this record that also doesn't sell until 1972, after Duane has died, when they re-released Layla as a single. So I left a lot of that story out because the way the story had been really well told, and it was this idea that Duane had like Eric Clapton was everybody's choice guitarist in the late 1960s. All guitarists were looking to him, and here's this 24-year-old kid who's 23 who's going toe-to-toe with him on a record. And it's a fantastic record, but I left it on the floor, and here's why. I hadn't thought about this. And I was like, what is the significance of Derek and the Dominoes for Duane? It didn't make him famous. Eric Clapton offered Duane a job in his band at $5,000 a week-ish, which is a tremendous amount of money. If Duane's making $100 a week at this point, maybe he's making a couple hundred. So Eric offered him the thing, and Duane chose to stay in his band. To me, that's a remarkable thing. So I lopped off that whole story and just really focused on their musical partnership and how Duane influenced Eric, but less about how Duane influenced that album and things. I thought it was less important. People go in a lot of detail in that stuff I didn't need to. I think if I was going back through it, one thing I would change for sure is, so Duane Allman dies in a motorcycle accident October 29th, 1971. A year later, almost to the day, in November 11th, 1972, Barry Oakley dies in a motorcycle crash as well. And close to the exact
same spot.
Right,
they're near each other. It is Southern Gothic rock and roll tale that you can think of. And what I think I missed in the book that I didn't say quite as clearly is after Duane dies, the band went on a 90-date world United States tour with a 5-man band, and they toured hard. And at the end of that tour, Barry Oakley died. And I will say that it's that tour, and I always say this, saved the band. It's why they continued all these years. They went out on tour, they made magical music without Duane, but it killed Barry. And I didn't say it that way. I should have thought about it later, and that, in saving the band, Barry also died. And I think I could have said that. And the other thing is, going more into Duane's slide playing and his influence. Duane played slide guitar, which is put a bottle on your finger or a piece of metal, and you slide. I actually don't have a slider, I would show it, but and I don't play it real well either, but Duane played slide guitar, and it was unique, it was new, and he made his mark with that. And I didn't go a lot in depth in the book with that because it was also something everybody was like, yeah, Duane Allman slide guitar, and I was like, no, great band leader, great guitarist, who also played slide. So those are the main ones there. And then I chopped up a whole chapter on the history of the South, because it was a really surface bad chapter. It was there to fill a gap on because I wanted to give some dissertation. I wanted some context, exactly. But the Southern story here, I want to tell each of y'all this, and I haven't gotten into it, but it's a small town Southern story. It's not a rural Southern story like we understand the blues to be. These folks moving into the city, Memphis in particular. It's a small town Southern story, and it's small towns mostly affiliated in and around where the federal government has an active presence, whether it be a military base, defense manufacturing, or it can be manufacturing, could also be, for example, Muscle Shoals has the TVA, but all of these little small towns, the federal government is providing jobs in that town, people are there, cultures are mixing, and the youth, some of y'all are of this age, have money for the first time and are spending that money and forming bands, and so the South is vital, but tracing that whole thing wasn't vital to this narrative, if that makes sense.
Yeah, sure. Well, that's with any topic, with any book. It's literally impossible to include everything, because when you think of one detail, 5 crop up, right? It's like
story of my life, brother.
They're like mushrooms. So, well, and that's academia too, right?
Yeah.
Academia keeps asking, and then. So when you release something in academia, the next thing you release is the follow-up.
Yeah.
And then it's the follow-up. So that's why academia is still here, because we keep asking the questions. But anyway, I think we should transition to some questions. Any comments, suggestions, questions for Bob? Yes, and you know what? I'll go around so that everybody can hear.
After Duane died, and then they went out on tour without him, how did they come to hire a new guitarist? And was that Warren Haynes, or did they go through some other guys before they settled down?
Great question. So Duane dies in late 1971, and the band tours as a quintet, as a 5-piece, without a second guitarist. And then sometime in summer of '72, late '72, they add Chuck Lavelle to play piano. And Chuck who is in the band from '72 really through about 1976. So they don't add a second guitarist; they add a piano player. In 1978, they reform, and they had Dan Toller on guitar. Dan, who spent a lot of time, I think he spent most of his life in Sarasota after he joined the band. So they had a 2-guitar lineup from 78 to 81, and Warren rejoined in 89. So they broke up from 82. They broke up from 82 to 89. And when they reformed in 89, Warren Haynes joined on guitar, and then Alan Woody joined on bass. And that was really what kept them on the road. They were really good from when they first started in '89 on. They stayed together for 25 years after they reformed in '89. Yes, ma'am. I'll just re-ask it.
And I'll just, I'm trying to think of how to form this. So they were kind of the ultimate jam band, if you will, and that conversation, you started this talking about jazz. And this conversation back and forth. I've seen a lot of these bands, and I've seen a lot of jam bands, and it's not my thing. And it got me to the point where I was like, oh, it's just a language I don't speak. I listen to a lot of reggae bands, and obviously, like even Steve Winwood, he would do the jamming.
Mhm.
There's a lot of people that do it. It feels like they were one of the first, but the foundation is jazz. And I see a lot of reggae bands and a lot of behind the scenes drummers will talk, and they always have a parent that was a jazz musician. So I was like, oh, jazz, there it is again. Foo Fighters, Dave Grohl's book, he talks about his mom taking him to a jazz club.
Sure.
So the foundation feels like it's always jazz under all of these ones, only nobody knew, or I didn't know it, but I don't know if anyone else knew it. And the foundation, so I guess the connection in my head is there, and is that, I don't know if there's really a question, or maybe you can comment on that foundation, what really influenced them, and how did they become who they were? And a lot of their fans probably didn't even know what their foundation was.
So that's a big part is influence, and I know Chris has done this with his U2 stuff and everything else. Influence doesn't come out sounding like the original, right? Because otherwise it's not an influence, it's a copy, right? So the I don't know that any of the Allman Brothers, except for J-Mo, understood or knew anything about jazz before they started, other than maybe a little bit of stuff that they'd listened to. J-Mo introduced them specifically to John Coltrane and to Miles Davis. Coltrane's My Favorite Things was the one that really got them that album, and Kind of Blue by Miles Davis so those are the real basis for them. It's hard for me to explain what I'm going to explain to you, but I know exactly what you're talking about, and I also understand too, drummers and jazz. That's a big part of jazz, is the rhythm of it, and it's different. It's the syncopated rhythm and those sorts of things. But no, I just had a brain fart on that one. We were talking about
Jazz.
Yeah. I had it. It'll come back to me. It'll come back to me like in the middle of the night tonight, and I'll be like, "Holy crap! I totally forgot what that was." I guess I should say this.
Their influence. And
You don't have to understand it really to the jazz impulse. And Chris probably has a lot more of this than I do, but like improvisation is it's a very African American medium. I've got some of that in the book, and jazz is all about that, and it's really hard to say what is jazz. Like, for example, what is psychedelic rock? Well, when I was reading definitions, writing them, I'm like, that's just jazz by guys who can't play. Essentially, but it is they're calling it the jazz impulse, and the way I say it is, this conversation with Chris, I'm feeding off what he's giving me, he's feeding off what I'm saying. Everything from the temperature in this room to y'all's engagement to his questions, my answers, all of these things are feeding into how this conversation makes itself happen. And jazz is like a freedom thing. Do you have a comment? You probably have a lot on this one.
Well, I mean, what pop and rock music listeners, aficionados, fans, audiences, they cannot forget is rock came from the blues. Rock was originally black music. And where did the blues come from? Mississippi Delta. It's a slave tradition. It's an enslaved people's tradition. The blues started in the Delta, and that gave rise to jazz as the blues filtered down south to New Orleans. And then in New Orleans is when the various outgrowths of jazz and, eventually, rock and roll was born. So when Bob's talking about the jazz influence in rock, yeah, because rock is a direct outgrowth of jazz, which is a direct outgrowth of the blues. And Bob mentioned the improvisational aspect of it. And the blues were created by, again, enslaved people in the fields. They weren't musically trained. They knew a tune. And so they just started singing the tune to help them get through their slog of a day. And as they were doing it, people started improvising. And that's how the blues, the American blues, was born. And that eventually turned into jazz, which is America's contribution to the world art scene. Jazz is an American art form that was born right here. Right? But rock came out of that. So when you say that, I think you understand more about it than you think you do. It's just, it might use a slightly different vocabulary. But reggae, it's related.
Yeah, I would say so too.
It's all related. It's just, think of it maybe as a dialect of a language and not a completely different language. Yeah, because again, it's all related. It's all country music was originally black music too, and it came from the blue. It's all the pop music that we have today. It's all from the same source. It's all from the same source.
I'm going to give him the final word on that, and here's what I'm